everyone. Depending on where you're joining us from, I hope you're having a beautiful day like we do here in Chicago, or a good evening, completion of the day. My name is İpek Yosmoğlu, and I'm the director of the Keyman Modern Turkish Studies program here at the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs at Northwestern University, and I also teach the history department here. So some of you are familiar with our book series, and today is we're concluding this year's at least Zoom series with a very, appropriate book. And in fact, this was supposed to be, this talk has been in the works for a long time, but for several reasons, we could only do it now, and still it turned out to be really timely. So let me introduce our speaker, who needs no introduction. Here's the book, by the way, and we still have a few copies left available if you want to drop by and pick them up, or if you're on campus, we can send them to you. So our speaker, our author and speaker is Dimitar Bechev. Dr. Bechev is currently an affiliate of the Russian and European Studies. Is it a program or?
It's a program, yeah.
Program at Oxford University, which also happens to be his alma mater. Oxford University's School of Global and Area Studies. And he's also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. His research interests are the politics of Central and Eastern Europe, the Balkans and Turkey, as well as Russian foreign policy. That's quite a portfolio. And he also has published extensively in all of these fields. Of course, there is the present example, but prior to that, I'm going to cite a few titles here. There was the Historical Dictionary of North Macedonia, which was published by Roman in 2019, and Rival Power, Russia in Southeast Europe, which was also published by Yale University Press. This was in 2017. And a little more recently, he was the co-editor with Nicu Popescu and Stanislav Secriero. I hope I pronounced that right. Russia Rising, Putin's Foreign Policy in the Middle East and North Africa, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2021. And next, we have our commentator, our discussant of the book, Karabekir Akkoyunlu. Karabekir Akkoyunlu is a lecturer at the Department of Politics and International Studies at SOAS, University of London, where he convenes the MSc, Master of Science, in Politics of the Middle East program. He was previously a visiting scholar at the University of Sao Paulo, a lecturer at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in Brazil, and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Graz, Austria. Dr. Akkoyunlu's research interests include comparative politics of democratization and autocratization, regime guardianship, and civil-military relations with a specific focus on Turkey, Iran, and Brazil. He also has a very extensive publication record, so I'm limiting myself to a few titles, representative titles. Very recently published Brazil's Stealth Military Intervention in Journal of Politics in Latin America, 2022, The 5 Phases of Turkey's Foreign Policy under the AKP, Social Research, 2021. And I also would like to mention that he is the co-editor with Kerem Öktem of a very important edited volume titled Exit from Democracy, Illiberal Governance in Turkey and Beyond, and this was published in 2018. Dr. Akkoyunlu is currently completing a monograph, which we're looking forward to, titled Guardianship and Democracy in Iran and Turkey, Tutelary Consolidation, Popular Contestation, which will come out with Edinburgh University Press soon, we hope. Okay, before we start, let me tell you, first we'll have our author talk about the book presented, and then we'll have comments and some questions from Dr. Akkoyunlu. And In the meantime, if you have questions, just feel free to type them in the chat. We'll take questions from chat. I'll either consolidate them or read them one by one. And you also, if you want to make another, comment yourself and turn the camera on, just raise your hand and we can also accommodate that. So please, Timo.
Thank you so much, İpek. It's a privilege to be part of this conversation. I'm really thankful to the Keyman Center for having me once more here. It's not my first appearance.
Yes.
It's like keep coming back to the scene of the crime, as it were, and I'll try to make it worth it. Though I must say from a get-go that I'm somewhat intimidated because you have so many scholars of Turkey coming from the country. So as the English say, I'll be selling coals to Newcastle. I'm sure there's a Turkish expression as well to
Yes.
describe my situation. I'm also fortunate because right now we're at the cusp of a very important event, which is the election in Turkey on the 14th of May, that lots of people are speculating. Even today, The Economist, as we were chatting, around the cover, calling it the most important election this year, 2023. And of course, President Erdogan didn't shy away from commenting and striking back. And I was reminded that you have other instances of people taking on The Economist, leaders. Even Lenin belongs to the category of somebody who picked up beef with this London-based journal. But be it as it may, it's hard to underestimate the significance of this critical moment. And just to put my cards on the table from the outset, I have no idea how it will play out. It's a 50-50 election. I get asked all the time. I'm sure you are as well, both Karabekir and İpek. But it's an important threshold. Now, going back to my book, what is the story behind this publication? It's in a way reflects a good decade of my work and research. Really, my interest in Turkey has been long-standing, even from my days as a DPhil student, although I worked on the Balkans and touched only tangentially Turkey. But later on, when I joined a think tank, abandoning academia for a period of time, I worked for the European Council on Foreign Relations. When I was covering Turkey, I was the main person responsible, and we are talking about the periods after 2010 towards to 2015, and that was a critical moment because things were hanging in the balance. Turkey was not yet abandoning democracy. I mean, it was deteriorating. Things were moving in the wrong direction, but there was quite a bit of democratic residue. And there were always people, including myself, I plead guilty, saying that there was some silver lining despite everything in this early period. And then, of course, 2015, 2016 was the inflection point where Turkey moved to a very different regime, which scholars have described as competitive authoritarianism. And one of the tasks of this book is to understand why that happened, why Turkey abandoned democracy, as it were. Although, to open the parenthesis, this is not a political science book. It's a survey text that tries to synthesize a lot of material, tries to tell the story, as it were, to a broader readership, rather than flesh out some political science, social science theories and speak to a niche audience. There's a lot of questioning around this issue. As everyone knows, there's a blame game going on because a good number of early critics of Erdogan and AKP are pointing a finger to some liberal fellow travelers in the early days, saying you guys legitimized the power grab. You basically condoned it, gave it the veneer of respectability, whereas this person from the outset was dead set on capturing power and establishing this one man regime. I'm not of that school. I think it's a more complicated story. And also, another footnote there. It's not a book about Erdogan, really. It's not a biography. It's an account about Turkey, but there's no way around this personality. But the story itself starts very much in the 1980s. I see lots of continuity in the Turkey of today with Turkey as we've known it for the past 30 to 40 years. There is quite a bit of the déjà vu. Think about the Turkish economy, right? The new Turkey of Erdogan purported to have ended the cycle of boom and bust, that the Turkey was set to grow and to modernize and to move forward. But what we discovered is that we are back into this scenario of economic instability, where political fiat trumps the technocratic logic. So that's an echo of the 1990s. The return of the Kurdish issue with vengeance after 2015 is another echo of this period of troubles that Erdogan was supposedly putting an end to. His alliance with the Nationalist Action Party around 2016, 2017, certainly after the coup, is an echo. And some of the features of Turkish foreign policy, both positive and negative, speak to this earlier periods. The disputes with Greece and Cyprus in the Aegean and the Eastern Med is straight out of this decade when I was coming of age in the 1990s. So continuity is something I really stressed upon and tried to take some issue to the extent with this idea that Erdogan transformed the country, which he did, but also it's fascinating to think about the threads linking the Turkish political past. On that note, this puts the whole question about democracy and autocracy in Turkey in perspective. So Turkey before Erdogan was not a stellar example of a democratic regime. We are aware of all the flaws it had, starting with military interference in civilian politics, rampant nationalism, state capture and policy capture in a very much more decentralized way, because coalition governments played a role. So Erdogan and the AKP ultimately, when they embarked on this journey, and I think it started around 2008, and I'll come back to this point. So when they embarked on the journey of capturing power and reshaping the state, they could actually harness a tradition of strong statehood, nationalism, and sort of opposition to minority and human rights that was out there already in one shape or form. Indeed, one of the big stories, this real political realignment, how the original coalition behind the AKP, which included more liberal segments of Turkish society, also the Kurdish movement in a way, as a fellow traveler, was totally reshaped around the time of another crucial election in 2015. So from a party looking towards the EU, towards integration, towards liberal reform, AKP ended up being the party of the strong state and nationalism, and became a critical part of the governance mixture. So nationalism, of course, is another cross-cutting theme. And as scholars of Turkey know, it comes into many shapes and sizes. There is a secular version of nationalism, but as we know, we've discovered there is a version which is totally compatible with Islamist or political Islam that became the mainstream in the Turkey of today. So it's hard to dismiss the agency of Erdogan, who at some point obviously discovered that the only way to prosper in politics is to actually concentrate power. But he was not stepping into the void, and sadly the authoritarian legacies in Turkey took an upper hand. So this is the bad part of the message in the book. Having said that, I think I'm a bit more hopeful than other people for the long term. Turkey has been notoriously unable to consolidate a democratic regime. And we've just had this discussion with Kara before in previous iterations of this panel. Now, because of issues, state formation, the nature of political competition, any number of issues. So moving from electoral democracy to consolidated democracy with established rule of law has always been a challenge, even in those golden period. In the golden period in the early 2000s, when the EU was the goal, and it looked as if the country is moving into the right direction. But at the same time, consolidating an autocratic regime has proven equally difficult in Turkey. Maybe that's the time to plug in another special issue that Kara and Karabekir are now preparing on the limits of autocratization. For the simple reason that Turkey has a tradition of free elections, maybe not fair elections, because it's not an even playing field. Obviously, now we have the perfect example. I mean, if some key opposition figures are in jail, and if media is very partial, you don't have a fair election. But on the day of election, people express their opinions and express their preferences. What happened in Ankara and Istanbul in 2019 at the local election, despite the recount in Istanbul, testifies there's some resilience, and the institution of election still matters, unlike other authoritarian polities. I mean, it's difficult to compare Turkey in that respect to its Middle Eastern neighbors. It's difficult to compare it to Russia or to the post-Soviet authoritarian policies, because 70 years of election that defined who run the country does matter. Political parties in Turkey have resilience as well. They have ideology, and they've have following, and they command loyalty among different parts of the population. And we've seen how they've learned to cooperate and to contest in this system that is not where the odds are stacked against them. Some wishful thinking there, maybe here for the 14th of May vote, but the theoretical point still holds that there are some limits to how much control Erdogan can exert over the political process. And ultimately, his legitimacy hinges on winning elections. And there is no other source of legitimacy. And finally, which is a nice segue into the second part of my book, which deals with foreign policy, Turkey remains dependent on the outside world. Of course, now it discovered yet another source of natural gas and the speculation of oil, but it's not a resource-based state. The regime is not based on a resource, it's based on integration in the outside world, notably with the EU. So those linkages do matter, I think, over the long term. And that's another story that I tell in the book, how after the coup in 1980, Turkey became more and more integrated into the global marketplace or capitalist system, if you will, and how European integration played a key role. So the story starts with Turgut Özal, really, in many respects. But this provides some traction or some guardrails that also plays into the mix why Turkey cannot go full authoritarian, because it depends. And the market is a corrective. I mean, if you have inflation, if you have economic downturn, then you see your AKP losing support over part of the electorate that were economic voters. They supported Erdogan because he was the best thing on offer. And he did deliver economic growth, and he had legitimacy based on the fact that a generation of Turks had their lives improved in those early decades of AKP rule. So that's why I think, again, my point is that eventually Turkey will revert to the old system, which won't be a perfect democracy. It won't be Sweden or Finland, just to mention two countries that are in the news in Istanbul and Ankara. But it won't be Syria, Bashar Assad, or it won't be Egypt or Russia. It will be a messy democracy with various factions vying for support, with serious issues around the rule of law and around minority rights. But the strongman system is hard to sustain over the long term. So that's my prediction. I might go horribly wrong, and we can revisit the argument after this particular election. But I still feel that that's how it will play out. Now, the second part of my book, because again, this is a 30-60 degrees account of Turkey, deals with foreign policy. In fact, in all honesty, this was the original intention. I wanted to do a book on Turkey in the world, because again, the last decade was linked to major upheavals and the Arab awakening, the initial stages of the war in Ukraine, or with Turkey being right in the middle of those developments. And one thing which is important to say is that Turkey has evolved in that respect, because also the world has evolved. It's no longer an appendix of the West. It doesn't see itself as a member of the Western alliance. And this perception is not necessarily limited to the AKP, although it's prevalent amongst people around Erdogan. But it sees itself as an independent player capable of influencing neighboring regions. Now, of course, some imperial nostalgia plays into it, but also it's about the changing structure of world politics, a multipolar world as it is, and the challenges Turkey faced, really starting since the 1990s, upheavals in its neighborhood. And again, continuity. It's not that Davutoglu, Erdogan, woke up one day and discovered that Turkey could not be fully beholden to the West and start engaging with neighbors in the Middle East. That was something that was critical to Özal's foreign policy. Of course, Turkey saw itself as a fellow traveler of the West when the Cold War ended, and it sought to expand economic opportunities and trade and financial assistance to Central Asia, to the Middle East, to the Caucasus. So there was this moment in time. And later on, somebody called Ismail Cem as foreign minister, he was also, although coming from the secularist part of the political spectrum, very much in this mode of thinking. And he's the one who shook hands with Greek foreign minister Papandreou at the time. So Turkey as a regional actor, as the zero problem actor, is nothing new. And it's driven partly by the economy and also by geostrategic changes, which also is relevant to this other question we get asked all the time. What happens if the opposition wins? What sort of foreign policy they'll pursue? Obviously, it will be much more closely aligned with the West, because they've made all the noises about the EU. I'm sure they'll be freeing some political prisoners, including some friends of ours, which will unblock cooperation with the EU. Maybe there won't be a return to membership negotiations. There's too much to ask. But improvement in many areas is possible. For instance, upgrading the customs union, which has a huge role in the Turkish economy. So that there'll be a slight turn to the West. But I don't think that they'll abandon the pursuit of strategic autonomy that was so critical to Erdogan's foreign policy over the past years. For instance, I don't see a future Turkish government cutting ties to Putin and imposing sanctions or joining the Western sanctions, if only because Turkey is a neighbor of Russia and tries to minimize the damage, as well as maybe play a role in mediating. So there will be continuity beyond the AKP of the sort of foreign policy we've seen developing in those years. But again, I don't think Turkey can disentangle itself from Europe, going back to my previous point, because linkages at the level of society, at the level of economy, are still very important, and they'll play a role going forward. And I'm happy to discuss that further in the Q&A. So yeah, again, the point is that over the long term, Turkey is not doomed to be an authoritarian country. It will be an ambitious player. Whether it will succeed in projecting its influence, we don't know, because that's dependent on so much else. But also, again, interdependence will continue to put Turkey and the EU together in many ways, even if we decide, and if even it's clear that this promise of the early AKP era of membership is off the table, and I don't think it will come back ever. So I feel I've spoken for way too long, despite Turkey is a country that can be subject to at least 3 or 4 more sessions like this one. But I'm handing over to Karabekir, and I'm curious to see what he thinks, and especially given the elections. So thank you so much for your attention.
Shall I jump in? Okay. Dimo, I disagree with you completely. Of course, this is not the case. We have discussed these issues before, over the years, in fact, and we've even discussed your book. I have a signed copy of it here next to me. So, we are revisiting a lot of these issues and topics, but of course, in the eve of the elections, or just before the election. So, and that adds the context. Maybe we should also push this conversation towards. But before doing that, let me start with some well-deserved praise for this book, which how Turkey under Erdogan, how a country turned from democracy and the West. I have recommended Dimo's book to very different profiles of people, to my students of politics and international relations in Brazil, who basically wanted to understand more of Turkey, to understand Brazil and what would happen if an autocrat stayed in power for an extended period of time, and saw Turkey as a paradigmatic case, if you will, of autocratization, and which is how the political science literature also refers to the country. But also to my Turkish friends who, the intensity of Turkish political and social agenda and headlines sometimes makes us forget, how different things were, but also how similar in many ways a decade ago, 15 years ago. And your book, even to people who lived through some of these events, it works as a sort of great narrative that it weaves a narrative through these 2 decades, and even actually goes back further and reminds us where it all started, some of the dynamics that we might be, we might have forgotten now. And so it has a wide, it should reach a wide readership, and I think it's a great reference book. Now, I think the title is a little misleading in one way, actually, because if you look at the title, you think it's all about Erdogan, but you say from the early on that any analysis of Turkey's transformation that focuses exclusively or even overwhelmingly on the figure of Erdogan, which of course we cannot put aside, would be superficial and would miss some structural continuities. I think the book in particular, and in the presentation you also mentioned, focuses on some of the historical structural continuities within Turkey. But of course, you also put it in the context of wider structural shifts and changes, and also continuities. So, for instance, if I read the title, How a Country Turned from Democracy and the West, I feel it's the country that is dynamic, but democracy and the West are static. But of course, as we know, and as you also, I think, clearly with nuance put through in the book, everything changed in the period that you're covering. democracy, how we perceive it, how it's been practiced. Mass approaches to ideas of democracy have changed, and also the West has not been the same, right? And in that sense, I think it makes perfect sense to read Turkey through these structural continuities, but also these very fundamental shifts in the wider regional, but also global context, in paradigm of liberal democracy, and it's struggling. One could even argue that it's not there anymore. And which West are we talking about? Turkey has moved away from the West, but on another level, it has become more European than ever, with now the discourse of anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobia becoming so predominant. It looks like a different type of West, or Western. So we're even commenting the other day how Turkey has finally become a European country because it has basically borrowed the anti-immigrant sort of agenda and made it its sort of own local agenda. And the rise of nationalism, I think it's also part of this backlash against globalization, the unfulfilled promises of liberal democratization. In that sense, so maybe one question I could put to you to sort of maybe reflect upon is, to what extent is Turkey a mirror of these changes? We often talk about Turkey as, this country that, the cliche is that Turkey is this bridge, this crossroads, right? We don't like that analogy, but at the same time, we know that it is, due to its geopolitical position, and also the fact that it is a country that is so integrated into the global economy, and the multi international and supranational organizations. It's a recipient of dynamics from outside, right? So Turkey was considered a democratizing sort of model in the early 2000s, when that model was also more popular, and then it became a paradigmatic case of autocratization when we started talking about autocratization globally. So my question is, putting aside Erdogan perhaps, or what are the sort of limits of autonomy or in Turkey's own sort of ability to create its own story that separate or different from the wider dominant global trends? It seems like Turkey is importing these trends at a very sort of intensive rate. And so maybe when we're talking about the future of Turkey, we should also talk about the future of the global system, future of democracy, which I also agree with you, and in fact with the economists as well, will partly be perhaps defined by this election in Turkey, right? I think, as a paradigmatic case of autocratization, Turkey, if that autocratization can be stalled, or at least slowed down through Turkey's internal social-political forces and through democratic elections, I think that's going to be a huge story and inspiration. I would argue it would be a bigger headline than Bolsonaro's defeat in Brazil, but even Trump's defeat, perhaps, than in the United States. So you talked also about, a lot of these discussions were discussions we had years ago as well, and we often wrote about them, but sometimes it's hard to go back and reflect on our memories or our feelings about those periods. You mentioned the golden years. You mentioned it in your talk as well, and there's this chapter in your book called The Golden Years. There is, and you partly alluded to this, there's a school of thought in Turkey that retrospectively doesn't see the golden years as golden years, but rather the beginning of these dark years. That retrospectively at least sees as the groundwork for what was to come later. I also believe that there was no inevitability to the path that Turkey took. It's a more complex period, and I don't share in any way with the hounding of the liberal intellectuals who thought there was a chance of democratization. But I also think there is a need for, a healthy amount of self-reflection. Now, I was listening to Cengiz Çandar the other day, in two different Turkish journalists, who is now going to stand as a parliamentary candidate for the Green Left Party or the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party. And in two interviews, in one of them, he seemed to be like simply full of praise for what he has done for the Kurdish cause or Turkish democracy. And in another interview, he was asked if there's a need for self-criticism, and his answer was, "I have no space for or time for self-criticism. That's a Stalinistic sort of tradition that that I have no time for." So I thought that was not very wise, actually. So were there early signs that were ignored, and what could have been done differently? I guess the question here, maybe a thought exercise, would be, if we were to go back and change one thing in these very early years, what would that be? Would it be the support for the 2010 referendum, Yetmez ama evet, or was that not that important actually that much anymore? So that's something, maybe that's something we could talk about a little bit. I mean, there was clearly no inevitability, but what would have taken for things not to go this bad? We also want to go away from determinism. We could also answer it from the point of view of European Union, maybe. And I'll finish with one. I think your most controversial take is at the end of your book, and we'll see about this very shortly. You say Turkey in 20 years will still be Erdogan's Turkey, and he will in all likelihood still be in charge. I mean, I agree with you where you later say even without him, Erdoganism will live on. I think he will leave behind a huge legacy, especially among his followers. New generations will make an even greater myth out of him. So if Abdülhamid was one, Menderes was one, Erdogan will be much bigger one, I think. But at the same time, I'm also thinking, to what extent will Turkey of 20 years? 20 years, I think, first of all, is a huge amount of period. We don't even know what the world is going to look like with all this, with climate change and AI. So maybe let's talk about 5 years' time. I'm not even sure Turkey will be Erdogan's Turkey in 5 years' time. I mean, there's one question of course, Erdogan's health, which, if you see the campaign, he's struggling. He doesn't have the momentum anymore. He's tired. The problem is he has nobody to back him up. There's absolutely no one to get on the stage with him and boost or give momentum to his campaign, boost morale. So there's only Süleyman Soylu. He has no successor. His coalition partners are lethargic. You better put them away rather than put them next to you. So can Erdogan alone, and institutionally, of course, his personalized power to a huge extent, can he alone? How far can he push this anymore? And you also talk a little bit in your book about the 2023 elections, which I don't want to be bring that back and say, look, let's see what happens. But you mentioned, for instance, what matters is who counts the votes as much as how many ballots each candidate gets. But you also say in your talk that Turkey's institutions and democratic resilience is not to be ignored. I agree with the second assertion, actually, that institutions are surprisingly resilient. We talked about this before as well. I don't think, if there is a very ambivalent situation, bureaucrats and civil servants will dare to step outside of the law glaringly, either way, in order to basically not make themselves personally complicit in case of a government change. So, but I think there's a chance that the government may refuse the election outcome, right? So this is something that we could talk about. I mean, Trump has tried it, Bolsonaro has tried it, Erdogan and Süleyman Soylu, they've been hinting at this, that if to delegitimize a potential opposition victory. The question is, so in the case of Trump and Bolsonaro, their supporters, raided the capitals, but they did not have institutional support. They did not have the support of the Congress. They did not have the support of the security forces, most importantly, and the judiciary. What will be the situation in Turkey? And also, I mean, Bolsonaro didn't really get support from international actors. Putin would probably put, not his neck, but would probably come out to support Erdogan in case of a sort of, choice between the opposition and Erdogan. So I think that's a very critical prospect. And maybe another possibility, however, is that if there is an election defeat, Erdogan actually accepts it. He steps down, even though it seems very difficult for us to imagine him packing his bags and leaving his 1,000-room palace. And at least formally allows for transition to take place. But then he makes the country ungovernable for the opposition. I mean, whoever leads the next government will be taking over a complete wreck of a country, in literal terms, but also in economic terms. So it's almost as if it would be a smart long-term strategy for Erdogan to step down, relinquish his, revive his democratic credentials, say that, see, I accept the result, make it impossible for the opposition to govern, and then in the earliest, opportunity possible with an early election, come back to power. I mean, we also have the case of sort of guerrilla public officials who will be in all of the institutions, supporting Erdogan, maybe not wanting to do Kılıçdaroğlu's bidding and making it just impossible for him to go. So maybe, a few words about some of those scenarios, short-term scenarios. But there was another, I think you asked the question, I think I've gone over my time, but okay. Just the last, one more, maybe a response or reflection on your question of can strongman politics persist in Turkey? I agree with you that clearly strongman politics has not been consolidated. It was very difficult to consolidate in Turkey, and clearly point out the difference between Turkey and Russia, for instance. But I think it will also persist in parts, and it will be difficult to sort of get rid of. Not only culturally, impact of Erdoganism on the political and social culture of Turkey, but also institutionally, the presidential system will be very difficult to reform. So, if you think about it, the one way for Kılıçdaroğlu, if he were to be elected president, is to stay in power, is to use in full the capacity of the presidential office, because he'll need the political expediency. So he'll have to renege on his promise of, going back to the parliamentary system. He'll have to, remain with presidentialism. And I think in the long term, as long as this overly personalized presidential system is in place, strongman politics will also persist. And secondly, at a more sort of like global level, I think, considering the transnational crises and the global instability that we're more and more facing, the strongman politics will continue to have certain appeal. Rather than the dialogue and compromise and long-term process that democracy requires, have one strong-willed person take these difficult decisions for us. So I think those are the challenges, to reforming strongman politics in Turkey. Anyway, I'll stop and continue maybe afterwards.
Do you want to just respond, and then after your response and during your response, we'll be taking questions?
So these are big questions that Kara posed, and I'll won't do justice to all of them, but I'll try to respond very quickly. Yeah, I think strongman politics will persist. Maybe not in the extreme form we have now, because it's difficult to have another Erdogan, who of course wants to be the father of the nation and rival Atatürk 100 years after the establishment of the republic. But some of the ingredients are there and they're not going away. Beyond presidentialism, another ingredient is populism, which is the universal language in Turkish politics and has been there for decades. So this is how leaders explain themselves and generate support, that they represent the people. So this is pretty much standard. Secondly, the lack of intra-party democracy, maybe with the exception of the HDP and the Kurdish movement. You have men, and now of course Meral Akşener is a bit of an exception, but typically you have all those party leaders who are there for life in their party, and they're bossing around the party structure. So that's another element. And paternalism as sort of the gendered image of the leader. So you have all the ingredients of this sort of political style. So even without the second Erdogan, some of the building blocks will be there. On scenarios going forward, yeah, I think the one you mentioned, the comeback, stepping down to come back, it's not unlikely. In fact, it's the most rational one. I'm not sure it will play out in Turkey like that, though. I mean, it will be a healthy, actually, it will be a healthy way forward for the country as a whole. I mean, Erdogan ensure his survival, has a prospect to come back. It's basically the textbook definition of democracy. You have a chance to regain power after a stint in opposition. The problem is in the condition where the rule of law has been compromised and it was weak to start with, how much you can count on being safe once in opposition. Maybe Erdogan can, but then again, you have so many other people linked to him, all his cronies and businesses who have real problems in any normally functioning rule of law situation. I mean, those people who built substandard buildings in the earthquake-stricken areas. So how can you ensure that your clientele will survive in the wilderness? This I don't have an answer. Although I suspect when it comes to those guerrilla judges, magistrates, and bureaucrats, that will be some sort of assurance that you exert influence behind the scenes. And even without that, there will be people who will be waiting to see which way the wind blows. So there won't be a defection, a wholesale defection the day after to Kılıçdaroğlu, because I mean, this is human nature. People are risk averse. They don't want to expose themselves after tens of years of repressions and purges and political trouble. So it will take time before the civil service and the judiciary changes the tune, I guess. So yeah, I mean, maybe this is a way to say that this is maybe the best case scenario, accepting defeat on the premise that you could actually come back. And Kara, you made also this comparison to Israel, the comeback of Netanyahu. So let's hope this is what Erdogan is playing out in his mind, and not Brazil or Trump, because it can really get ugly in Turkey. Election where the margin is probably very thin, and you can mobilize your supporters. And Süleyman Soylu saying it will be another instance of a coup as 2016, which is a dog whistle to supporters to contest the result. Going back, I mean, running through the questions. Yeah, I mean, I think when I say it will be Erdogan's Turkey in 20 years' time, maybe the mythology of Erdoganism, probably that's the key thing. And human conscience and political myth-making is prone to cherry-pick and to distort. So people will be telling the story in 20 years in a very different way that we are telling the story now. You look at the big infrastructure projects, achievements, the Bayraktar drones, and so on and so forth. And there'll be those partisans who will be singing praises to Erdogan and claiming his legacy, that I'm the next one in this tradition. That's my expectation. I mean, and it's good that you mentioned Abdul Hamid. I mean, IPEC knows that Abdul Hamid was the maligned figure for generations in historical memory in Turkey. And lo and behold, he came back in a big way, to the extent that now he's being described as the greatest ruler ever Ottomans have had. I mean, what a turnaround. And he's part of those popular series, and he's been recycled in all kinds of formats. So the reworking of Erdogan mythology will be a given. I think so, even if he leaves power for whatever reason. Going back to the golden years, quote unquote, what would have been done different? I think the critical variable, to my mind, is that around the mid-2000s, there was no credible opposition to Erdogan. I mean, you lived through this period, you know very well. You are a democratic-minded Turkish voter. You might be conservative, you might be liberal, you might be a leftist, anything. I mean, who was there apart from AKP to support, given that Deniz Baykal at the time, who at the end of his life actually aligned with Erdogan in his nationalist reincarnation, Erdogan's nationalist reincarnation. So yet, People's Republican Party taking a staunch anti-Western position, saying that the US is there to partition Turkey and Erdogan is a sellout to global capital and what have you. I mean, if the opposition is not left field and not able to pose a credible alternative and going against the grain, that was a heaven sent to Erdogan. If there was a more healthy political competition on issues like democracy and public policy, better delivery of economic agendas, also the EU, things could have played out differently. But then the opposition, 2007 with the Republican marches, then in 2008 with the closure case, I think they share the blame. Not 100%, obviously, Erdogan is the main culprit, but that's something that could have made things different if the secularist opposition, if Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu or something of the opposition we have now was there at the time. That's what I think. On Turkey, following global trends like the top-down, what is interesting to me is that when it came to democratization, say the golden period was between 1997 after the Luxembourg summit, all the way up to 2005-ish when Turkey started membership negotiations. Certainly 2006 with the terror legislation, that was probably a point of inflection. So those 8 years, Turkey was a latecomer on the democratization bandwagon. Many people in the 90s ruled that it was the missed decade, the lost decade, that Turkey basically was out of tune with the global trend. But it came later and it joined the bandwagon. When it came to autocratization, though, Turkey was a trendsetter. So it was at the forefront of the trend. It was not the laggard, it was the trailblazer. 2010 and onwards. I mean, 2010 was when Viktor Orban came to power. Of course, 2008, the global economic crisis. I mean, Turkey was very much at the forefront of those phenomenon when the liberal order and democratization took a step back. So that's some food for thought, that autocracy always had an easier ride in Turkey and democracy had more impediments, which also goes to show that, of course, there's the top-down structural dynamics, but what happens in a given country depends on contingency and local conditions. I mean, the choice of leadership, historical trajectory, societal values, and so on and so forth. So it's bound to be a dialectic between the big currents globally and local conditions, local trends, which might sort of facilitate some things, accelerate, or might be an impediment. I mean, Turkey resisted democratization for so long, despite everything. So that's my very rough answer to your question about how Turkey looks at the global backdrop.
Okay. Is there anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question personally? If so, please raise your hand. No? Okay. Well, I think I have a question, if I may. And then we have a question, we'll read that too, but it's a little I mean, it's not off topic, but we can it's very specific before we go into that. This is actually a question for both of you. I mean, it is one of the, of course, most significant accomplishments of Erdogan is, of course, you know, how he was able to mobilize religion and, you know, turn the Milli Görüş movement from like, it always was at the margin, and there was a limit to its, you know, what percentage of the vote it could acquire. And I mean, very cleverly using alliances, tactical alliances, he was, you know, able to harness that to consolidate his power, and you know, combined with his charisma and everything. So I'm wondering if you'd care to comment about Erdogan's, let's say, rise and fall, even though he hasn't, I mean, imminent fall, let's say. What does it say about political Islam in general, globally?
Yeah, maybe Kara can jump in this one.
Kara, you're still muted.
Okay, I will. I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. No easy answer, but perhaps the first thing that comes to my mind is to say that Erdogan and political Islam are not one and all. I think Erdogan, I mean, they overlap, and that's obviously the background he comes from. And I think left without any constraints, that's, you know, where he goes back to. And we see that very clearly in the period between 2009 and 2012, where which actually 2011, I would say, was the peak of his power, because at least, or peak of his confidence, let's put it that way, where he felt freed from internal domestic constraints and rivals, having put the generals and, you know, the Kemalist opponents in prison and purged them, won, the economy kept growing, won the third election, and while, you know, Europe was going down, Turkey was looked at around the region as a model, and all of these, you know, secular dictatorships were falling, and new political, you know, Islamist-rooted governments were coming to power in the Arab world. So that's, I think that was actually the beginning of a period of, you know, a divine destiny, which seeped into the thinking and acting of both Erdogan and also Davutoğlu, which Davutoğlu stayed with. Erdogan awoke from eventually, and then shifted. So, and that was a period when, also again with Davutoğlu's infusion, that Sunni Islam became a very clear reference in domestic and international politics. But when the situation changed, and that's what Dimo calls in his book A Rude Awakening. The rude awakening came to Erdogan. He was awakened. You know, many others weren't. Again, Davutoğlu still thought he could change Syria and he could change the world. And Erdogan shifted very cleverly. And I think what makes him such a resilient figure is his ability to detect changing shifts of power, both in the country, in the region, and globally, and jump from one wave to another, basically leaving behind old promises, old alliances, turning 180 degrees, making new friends out of old foes and making new foes out of old friends. So he's ultra pragmatic in that sense, and I think he is driven ultimately by a sense of course, destiny, which is steeped in the references that he comes from, but also a pure drive for power. So today, does Erdogan, the fact that Erdogan is in power, represent the peak or survival of political Islam? I don't think so. I mean, he has had to split with the Gülenists, and that created this huge fratricide between different branches of political Islam. He has stood by the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood for a while, but he's sort of thrown them under the bus as well. So I think political Islam will shift, will change. It's a transnational movement, and it will have different actors. But Erdogan can step out of it, can step back into it, and so their fate, I don't think, are unidirectional. I think Erdogan is as much a nationalist when it comes to it as the next person, which isn't really part of the political Islam's sort of book of references. But I wonder what Dimo will say.
No, I definitely agree. I think there's this tension, I think, that Turkey projected itself as a leader of this global Sunni community, but essentially it's a nation state, and what happens is very much confined by the nation state and by the limits and the traditions and the institutions of a nation state. So Erdogan acts as a national leader in the final analysis. Yeah, when conditions are right, he tries to explore those transnational linkages to be the leader. That was the case during the Arab awakening, early stages. But yeah, the default, and again, it's the national, it's the nation is there in the frame of reference. There's a strong degree of nationalism rather than Islamist universalism. That's his the default, and I definitely agree about his versatility. We saw it in foreign policy. I mean, 3 years ago or 4 years ago, Turkey was having conflicts with pretty much everyone. It fought a proxy war with the United Arab Emirates in Libya. It launched several incursions into Syria. It was threatening to use military force in the Eastern Mediterranean, and now it's all about resets, even with Greece. After Dengius came to Antakya, a very different tone vis-a-vis neighbors, certainly with the Saudis and the Emiratis, and now even Egypt and maybe Syria. So I wouldn't be able to predict that. If you asked me 4 years ago that will happen so rapidly.
I'll just, if you don't mind, step in to say that the milli görüş, the national, is an ambivalent national. It's not necessarily or immediately the secular nation states, but it also has references to millet's idea of millet's sort of national, pre-secular one, which also refers to the Islamic community, the Ottoman millet idea. So I think it also represents the ambivalence of political Islam in Turkey and everywhere else between nation state and transnational community.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read two questions. They're really different. There's one question that's specifically for Dr. Bechev, and so I'll read that, and then I'll read Ulaş's question too, that's more general. Okay, so Leo Maxim is asking, since Dr. Bechev is from Bulgaria, allow me to ask his take on Bulgarian Turks, and if he sees them having more important role for good relations between two countries in the future. Would a democratic restoration in Turkey also lead to the end of political segregation in Bulgaria vis-a-vis Bulgarian Turks? And then I'll read the next question, and that's from Ulaş Erdoğdu. Given that Erdogan already struggles and that inflation is there to stay, even if he gets re-elected, do you think that he will be able to rule? Would he be able to secure the loyalty of security forces in in case of an even worsening economy?
Yeah, very good questions. I don't think the level of democracy in Turkey has any bearing on the Bulgarian-Turkish community or bilateral relations, because Turkey is an important neighbor, and frankly, whoever happens to be in government in Sofia will have pretty much the same relationship. I mean, Erdogan is on very good terms with Sofia, and that's been the case for a long time. Be it because of economic interest, be it because of migration concern, any given reason. But the nature of the regime in Turkey makes no difference whatsoever, I think. Bulgarian Turks, I mean, it depends how you define marginalization. The Bulgarian Turkish elite is not marginalized. They're in parliament, they've been part of many governments. They sit in the European Parliament as well and get all the perks of European integration. I mean, people might be another matter, but it's important to note that they have agency, so they're not basically directed from Ankara. In fact, if you look at those people with dual citizenship who live in Bursa or Istanbul or Izmir, I think 60% of them probably vote for the opposition. And the main Bulgarian Turkish party, the MRF, historically never had a very productive relationship with Turkey. I mean, there was a moment when they were persona non grata. There was a ban on traveling in Turkey for some oligarchs connected to them because they involved in cigarette trade in northern Iraq and all kinds of other shady affairs. But again, going back to this point about flexibility, on both their side and on Ankara's side, now they're best of friends. I didn't expect that to become the case. Again, you're talking about a party which in 2015, when Russia and Turkey clashed over Syria, these people sided with Russia. I mean, the founder of the party famously went for Putin, the third one. This tells you something. But now, again, they're on the same page. So yeah, I mean, maybe there'll be a positive influence. But again, Turkey being democracy or non-democracy or anything in between doesn't really impact on those types of relationships. The other one, do you think that he'll be able to rule it? I mean, when it comes to the economy, I think there is a sense of false comfort amongst Erdogan and the AKP cadre, because it's not that the crisis started yesterday. That's been the default mode for years now. And somehow they always muddle through. I mean, they fire the central bank governor, they change the finance minister, they get some money from Abu Dhabi or from the Saudis, the swap line with China. There's always a way through to patch things up and to just keep going. I mean, it's not a great story, but it's not a meltdown that Turkey has seen in the past. So we haven't seen 2001 type of financial crisis, for instance. But there might be a false sense of comfort. If things continue the way they are, with interference in decision-making on the economy and Erdogan taking everything under manual control, there might be a huge crisis down the line that will wipe out the middle class in Turkey. So the economic equivalent of the earthquake, if you will. So that will be definitely a game changer. But equally, maybe that's not part of the question, but we had a session with Kara in a different setting, where we touched on the economy with another colleague. And one thing that emerged in the conversation, if the opposition seizes control of the presidency, it won't be easy to go back to orthodox economic policies, because the cost of readjustment, rapid readjustment, will be very high. So Kılıçdaroğlu administration has to tread very carefully when it comes to things like interest rates. It will be difficult to make a U-turn on many of the legacy decisions and policies from the Erdogan era. So it will be tough to readjust. And again, Erdogan will be waiting in the wings for the whole thing to explode, and then he'll say, remember how good it used to be under me when the economy was booming, and you need back a firm pair of hands, and you need me to save Turkey once more.
I know the question of Bulgaria wasn't directed to me, and I'm not going to address that question, but I wanted to just point out that when Dimo was mentioning earlier in his presentation that Turkey won't be Sweden, nor will it be Syria, I was thinking maybe it will be like Bulgaria. And of course, thinking back like 20, 25 years, if we were to say Turkey will be like Bulgaria in 25 years' time, that would probably open the question of how. You know, Turkey is so far ahead of Bulgaria in many ways. How will it be like Bulgaria? But it's a testament to how much both countries have changed, you know, over the intervening period, perhaps.
Well, that's an interesting remark, because the implication is then you have a kingmaker in the Kurdish party. So, I mean, one thing I didn't dwell on is that MRF in Bulgaria has played a very...
I think that's, given the two big blocks in the parliament, I think that's a real possibility. Neither bloc will have a parliamentary majority, so, you know, the left-wing coalition, or, you know, the Kurdish votes will be, or the parliamentary representation will be kingmakers. Could be. But in response to the question of coming economic crisis, I agree with Dimo. This is one of the reasons why I also thought that second scenario of Erdogan stepping aside in the case of a loss and making just the country ungovernable already, because it is looking at economic abyss, could make sense. But of course, it's from, you know, our perspectives of, you know, what makes sense and what is rational. And Dimo has rightly pointed out there are so many other constraints. So if Erdogan were to stay in power, he would definitely be facing, and as it would be unlikely for him to make a U-turn on a lot of his policies, not least because his clientelistic networks depend on his current, the continuation of his current policies. We would probably see a continuation of the downfall in economic terms. How far could Erdogan maintain control over the population, or even, you know, over institutions? The question that I actually hope we won't ever have to wait and see, because I want to see a different result. But in terms of the security establishment, there's of course a question of whether you're talking about the military or the police. I think the military is well funded and it's been thoroughly purged. So I'm not sure it's going to be posing a risk to Erdogan anytime soon. And interestingly, however, with the police, even though police forces have also been very much equipped with or recruited with nationalists with an MHP background, we'll see what the future brings in terms of Erdogan and Bahçeli's relationship and MHP, whether they're going to stay together. But there are also reports of the police really struggling economically, and this is something that has not been addressed. You know, police force and their loyalty is taken for granted because of the sort of background they come from. But they're really struggling. So it will be interesting to sort of watch that dynamic, which is a little bit under the radar. I think it's at the point.
But it would be cynical. There's a school of thought in Turkey saying that even opposition wins, there will be a nationalist faction in power, so EE party will be there. It's like in the casino. I mean, the casino always wins. So nationalism, those securitocrats will find another umbrella organization in Meral Akşener, who of course used to be the Minister of Interior in the dark days.
In fact, I think that's an important point to emphasize. One of the trends in Turkey now, and I think it goes back, I think that we have another question, it's related to this as well. One of the huge waves that is rising is this neo-nationalism. And it's everywhere. It's in the opposition, it's in the governing circles. And it has made, for instance, very difficult for us to address some of the sort of classical taboo issues of Turkey, which we had made so much progress in addressing, right? The foundational issues, Armenian Kurds, religion, and especially the Kurdish issue and the Armenian genocide. And it has become so difficult to address these issues publicly now because you're hounded right away by nationalists on both sides of the political divide. So, you know, in that regard, I think there's a huge backsliding. And, you know, for people who have worked on these historical issues and their sort of legacies, I think it's sort of disheartening to think what's going to happen. You know, there will be, even if there's a change of government, there'll still be a nationalist sort of environment. Will we start from scratch again to do what we were trying to do for so long? You know, 10, 15 years ago, thought we had achieved. So, yeah.
But it's ambiguous, isn't it? Because you also see some green shoots. I mean, there was this question here. I very much in tune with what you had to say. And what I'm referring to is Kılıçdaroğlu coming out of the closet on his Alevi identity. Maybe that was preemptive because he knew there would be dog whistle that AKP would say.
Dog whistle, actually,
yeah. So he's not a true Turk because he's not Sunni and Hanefi, whatever. And he sought to preempt it, and the response was very encouraging that people are willing to accept this minority identity as part of the mainstream. Equally, I mean, obviously the HDP or the Green Left Party is an indispensable member of the coalition, even if they are shy to admit it. When Erdogan says you sold yourself to the Kurds, I mean, there is a grain of truth there. So the discourse on the Kurdish issue has to change. And despite the return of the war against the PKK, to be the devil's advocate, it's hard to undo some stuff, the acceptance of Kurdish identity. The whole government rhetoric is we are not against Kurds per se, they are the brothers in Islam, we are against this terrorist organization, which is a step forward from what you had in the 1990s with just wholesale denial of Kurdishness. So maybe I'm being a bit naive, but I mean, seems that there are encouraging signs. Even on Armenia, if there's proper rapprochement, and Yerevan, not Armenians as a community, diaspora is all, but for Armenian foreign policy, for the state of Armenia, in this tough situation they face themselves, removing those obstacles with Turkey makes perfect sense because Armenia was let down by the Russians vis-a-vis Azerbaijan is squeezed and it basically has only run on its side. So if Turkey is much more forthcoming economically and otherwise opens the border, that will be a huge thing for Yerevan as an achievement. So let's see now how it plays out. I hope we get there because before we get into this conversation, we actually need to have Kılıçdaroğlu in the presidency, and it's not a given, unfortunately.
Okay, so yeah, that was, I mean, both of you have already responded to Anush Suni's question. There is a question, and this probably will be our last because we're running out of time. It is from Ellison Lamb. Should Erdogan remain in power, how worried should women be in particular for their rights, opportunities and freedoms in Turkey longer term?
Yeah, maybe I'm not the right person to respond this one because I'm an outside observer at best. I don't have real estate, not living in Turkey and being a man. But it's been really tough. I mean, you saw, for instance, this whole conversation about the Istanbul Convention. For those of you who haven't followed this one, it's a convention, Council of Europe, to fight the violence against women. But Turkey withdrew. I mean, I'm sad to say that also Bulgaria withdrew after constitutional courts ruled against it. There's this smear campaign about this particular law that it enables gender conversion. So Turkey became European in that respect as well because it became part of this conservative European backlash against the Istanbul Convention, named after Istanbul, an irony. So what I want to say is last years have seen a lot of backtracking. And even conservative women criticized this move by the AKP. So I don't think it will get worse. But also, I mean, credit where credit is due. I mean, I see resilience amongst women in Turkey fighting for their rights. The fact that, again, Meral Akşener, at the risk of boring everyone talking about this one personality all the time, she was faced the ambiguities of Turkey. On the one hand, a nationalist politician who is tainted by association of this anti-terror campaign. On the other hand, sort of a hopeful figure standing for women. Same with HDP, with the co-presidency institution. So, I mean, you have a lot of pushback from society on those issues. And final thought, which is a bigger point, I guess, this social engineering vision of AKP, that it will remodel society in its conservative image, doesn't seem to work looking at sociological data. It's not that people have become more conservative. If anything, there's the jack in the box effect, or the pendulum effect. The more you press people to conform with this new official ideology, conservative and nationalist, the more you see backlash, and levels of religious observancy haven't gone up. If anything, they've gone down. But yeah, I'm curious what you, Ipek and Kara, have to say.
Yeah, I think I'll say something very briefly, but I think Ipek should comment on this as well. I think that things could get worse for women, and I say that by the composition of what would be a new governing coalition. Now, that would be the most right-wing, most conservative coalition that has ever been assembled by AKP, by anybody. It would include, besides AKP and the MHP, the Yeniden Refah Partisi, whose basically entire platform is about making adultery a crime and opposing anything LGBTQ related, and Hüdapar, which basically campaigns for Sharia. So I think that's a worrying sign.
Okay, since I was also, I guess by virtue of being a woman from Turkey, brought into the question. In a word, my answer to this question would be, how worried should they be? Yes, they should be extremely worried. And I agree with you, with, the Kara said. And it's also, I mean, when you look at, it's not just Turkey. I live in the US, obviously, and we see what's happening here. And this is, it seems like, an emphasis on these so-called conservative values inevitably, weaponizes questions around women's, autonomy, their bodily autonomy, and their place in society. It becomes, political fodder very easily. And in, along with, since, we're talking about minority, not by number, but by, status, I guess we shouldn't also forget what is been happening with LGBTQ rights in Turkey, right? This was also a very important litmus test for them, and we saw what they did with it. Kind of brought to the forefront all the, how can I say, some of the assumptions perhaps we thought we were making about them, that they were all confirmed. And I doubt if they stick around, this is just going to get worse. And on the other hand, having said that, like you both pointed out, this is not really working. It's not working in this country, in the US, and I don't think it will be working in Turkey either. I mean, if anything, Turkish and Kurdish and, other, ethnic groups, women in Turkey, LGBTQ people in Turkey, again, the Kurdish movement, they have been, despite everything, they have been extremely resilient. And I think thanks to this, despite everything, they have been also able to reach a broader audience thanks to this, the current political, I mean, because it's such an umbrella, for the first time going as a united front. I think they have been able to make their agenda, better known. So that is one thing that gives me hope that even if they were to stay in power, they won't be able to, how can I say, band women to their will. Okay, if there are, I think, yes, there are no more questions. Okay, I'd like to thank you all. And hopefully we'll meet again. There will be a sequel to this. And maybe we'll be talking about Turkey over Erdogan, hopefully. And there will be more beautiful days ahead of us. We'll be, looking back at this time and, analyzing it from a more comfortable position. So thank you again. Thank you so much. I mean, you're like members of the program by now. That's what, how we consider you. And I hope we'll have another event. We'll meet at another event soon and maybe in person. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak.
Thank you very much.